Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of WORKOLOGY.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of WORKOLOGY.
An estimated 26.2% of Americans age 18 and older have suffered from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. That translates to about 57.7 million people. Outside of company employee assistance programs that a company offers, there's little resources or information for a larger and silent percentage of your workforce. Today, I'm shining a spotlight on workplace leaders and how they can handle mental health issues in the workplace. Today's guest is Sarah Fader. She's the founder of a nonprofit called Stigma Fighters, which dedicates their time to helping real people living with mental health issues. Sarah and Stigma Fighters have been published and featured in Psychology Today, The Atlantic, and The Huffington Post. Sarah, welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your background and how you came to write so openly and talk about this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in New York City, and I lived with chronic anxiety, though I didn't know what it was at the time. So I was always sort of an anxious child, and into my teenage years, I started to develop panic attacks. And when I was in high school, I thought there was something wrong with me, because I remember this one day, I was 15 years old, and I was sitting on the couch reading a comic book that if you're familiar with Neil Gaiman, it's called Books of Magic. And in the comic book, these characters that were supposed to be eternal die. And it got me thinking in an existential way. And I started getting afraid of the idea of the fact that I would no longer be on this planet one day. And that's when I truly experienced my first panic attack. And thankfully, my mother was available to help me through that. And she knew what was happening because she understands anxiety. She deals with it herself. So she helped me breathe through it. But that was not the first panic attack I would experience. I would have many more. And I had to put on this mask of pretending to be normal, in quotes. And so I would go to high school every day, and I went to a performing arts high school, and I was acting, but I was also acting in this way that I was pretending to not have anxiety. So it was kind of a double way of acting. And eventually, by the time I was 18, I was exhausted from the toll that anxiety took on my body. I would literally wake up every day just so nauseous, and I would throw up before I went to school because anxiety was so overwhelming to me. And this idea that I had to take care of myself and the fact that I had this chronic mental illness was it was terrible. It was really difficult for me. So fast forward into my adult life, I finally made the decision actually at 18 to go on medication. So I started taking antidepressants, and that was a game changer for me. It helped me to sort of function in a better way, and it got all the clutter out of my brain. So I was able to sort of see clearly. And, medication was not the only thing that helped my anxiety. I was in therapy as well, but it really helped me in a significant way. So I went on to graduate from New York University, and I would not have been able to do that without the help of medication. I went on to get married and have 2 beautiful children. And once I had my children, I decided that I really wanted to be open about this in a way that I had not been previously. And I had started blogging about my experience as a mother. And when I was reading blogs, other parenting blogs, I started noticing that the conversation was changing. People were starting to be open about living with postpartum depression and also just anxiety or depression. And I started finding other blogs where people would talk about living with other mental illnesses. And so I decided I wanted to come out of the closet. And that's when I told my story for the first time on the Huffington Post. I had started blogging for the Huffington Post, and I wrote an article called Fighting Against the Stigma of Mental Illness. And that's when I came out as having panic disorder, and I talked about how that impacted me. And I did it because I really wanted to express this part of myself that had been hidden for so long. And also, should my children ever develop a mental illness, I want them to know that it's okay, and that even if you live with this chronic condition, you're not alone, and that other people deal with these issues. So that was the reason I came out of the closet.
And so Stigma Fighters was developed from that, where you are helping people tell their personal stories about mental illness, right?
Exactly. So what ended up happening is, after that article was published, I started getting feedback from people all around the world just saying, thank you for sharing your story. I wish that I had a place to share mine. And I looked around the internet and I couldn't find a centralized location for people to share their stories. So that's when I created stigmafighters.com, and I started asking people to share their stories online about writing their story about living with mental illness. And it was very, very exciting, and it grew as a community. I met my business partner, Allie Burke, who lives with paranoid schizophrenia. She wrote for the website, and together she and I formed Stigma Fighters into a nonprofit organization. Then both Allie and I began writing for Psychology Today. She writes about living with schizophrenia. I write about anxiety, and we were featured on the front page of the Washington Post, and it talks about what we do at Stigma Fighters, and that was an extremely exciting honor. We also have 2 published anthologies of the stories on Stigma Fighters that are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about mental health, because you talked about anxiety, panic attacks, schizophrenia. What does this mental health topic actually encompass? Because it feels really large to me.
Sure. So mental health is actually what we strive for, right? So we want to make sure that we're balanced and that we are living our best life. But mental illness is what I live with and what so many people live with. So it's important to make that distinction. Do you know what I mean? So that's the thing, is that some people like to say mental health issues, right? So instead of saying mental illness, I prefer to use the term mental illness, actually, because it highlights the fact that this is legitimately, these are illnesses that people are living with and managing. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the most common questions or misconceptions people have about mental illness. Care to share?
Absolutely. So some of this is contingent upon what mental illness you're talking about. So for example, schizophrenia is a very highly stigmatized mental illness. So people think about, if you think about somebody who lives with schizophrenia, people might assume that they are homeless, or they're non-functional, or they are babbling to themselves while walking down the street. I can debunk that for you right now. Allie Burke is a highly functional person who works in corporate America and runs a literary magazine and is a best-selling author. So that's a misconception about people living with schizophrenia. I feel that it's dependent on the disorder. So people think that people with anxiety are exaggerating, or they're dramatic. People with depression are lazy. People with depression are unmotivated, and they're just not trying hard enough. Just suck it up. And that's the thing, is that people need to understand that these are real conditions and people are doing the best that they possibly can.
Well, let's take a little bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast. Today we're talking about the topic of mental illness in the workplace. And I have Sarah Fader here. You can follow Sarah on Twitter at the Sarah Fader, and that's SarahFader. So the and Sarah Fader. All right, so let's get back to this. I talked at the beginning of the show about mental illness and how it impacts nearly 27% of Americans each year. What are some ways that employers can help provide resources and support to this silent group of employees that just aren't maybe sharing with their employers or their bosses about what's going on with them in their personal or professional lives?
Many people don't realize that it's important to know the law. So the ADA states that that at work, you are entitled to reasonable accommodation based on your disability, right? So if you have a mental illness, you can go to your employer and say, I have this, condition, and I need accommodations based upon what I'm dealing with. Now, what the flip side of this is that being in a supervisor position, the employer, I feel like, needs to be more aware that when your employee comes to you and says, I'm dealing with PTSD, these are my triggers and I need you to be aware of that. I feel like where we need to work on this issue is that we need employers to be more understanding of the fact that it's difficult for your employee to come to you and tell you these things. There's probably shame associated with it. So just be there and understand that, offer your support and say, how can I help? That's the best thing, is that employers need to be open to asking that question. How can I be the most supportive to you?
Awesome. And it's an interesting misconception, and I'll put the resource in the transcript of the podcast, but the average cost of an accommodation, according to from the ADA, is less than $500 in most situations. So it doesn't have to be a big expense or a big huge cost for the employer when you have an employee come and say, hey, I have PTSD or I'm experiencing some depression. Here are the things that I need.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, it's true. And I think that employers need to understand that if they work with their employees, that they will come to, it's called reasonable accommodation for a reason, right? So reasonable accommodation, the implication is that it will be a reasonable thing that you're asking for. So it's not something that's completely out of left field. It's something that both of you come to that makes sense for the workplace.
Agreed. One of the challenges with mental illness is that it impacts your personal but also your professional life. And things like lack of sleep or insomnia or mindfulness or exercise can have a direct positive impact on your mental wellness. How do we educate and motivate leaders that can encourage activities like healthy sleep or having time away from work to be able to perform better?
That's an excellent question. I think that there should be corporate workshops about how important sleep is. I really do. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's true. And I think people, especially in the United States, there's such a propensity for burnout because there are so many workaholics. Like the American culture tells us, work, 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 don't take a break. Sleep is so important, and knowing your limitations and knowing that if you are getting the adequate amount of sleep, you will do a better job at work, right? Mental illness or not. Okay, but I think that needs to be stressed in the workplace.
It's kind of interesting because companies like Fossil, for example, they're getting ready to do a campaign for wellness that encourages their employees to get at least 8 hours of sleep over the period of 2 weeks to try to focus and shine a spotlight on this mental wellness.
I love that. That's such a phenomenal idea.
Any thoughts on how companies can create a work culture that maybe is more accepting of some of the things that you're describing?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think just the concept of being open to what the other person is telling you. So that happens. I think, just knowing that if an employee comes to you and expresses something that you're maybe not familiar with, whether it has to do with mental illness or not, but particularly if it has to do with mental illness, just keeping an open mind. And if you don't understand where that person is coming from, asking questions and really attempting to meet them where they are and understand.
Awesome. Yeah, other things come to mind for myself too. You mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I think that that's a great start. However, leaders need to have training and understand the process for when somebody does request an accommodation, right?
Yes. Oh, you know what? Just to piggyback on what you just said, I think that is very much needed in corporate America. So this idea of training higher level executives on what to do when your employee asks for accommodation.
Even frontline managers, because you might have a manager at a manufacturing plant or a retail store or an office, and this is not something necessarily that they deal with every day. So when somebody does come, and not everybody says, I need an ADA accommodation, right? It might be worded differently. So awareness and training around those things, I think, is really critical so that managers can identify that, hey, this might be what they're really asking.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Excellent point.
Can you talk a little bit more about the future plans for stigma fighters and where you guys are going in terms of sharing stories for those with mental illness?
Sure. So we are continuing to share the stories of people living with mental illness on stigmafighters.com. We are continuing to publish these anthologies with the stories. My goal with Stigma Fighters is to do more public speaking and go to universities in order to create chapters of Stigma Fighters so that college students can have peer support groups. And that's what I really would love to do, is just get it into the culture more. So get college students speaking about mental illness and how it affects them in academia.
What do you say to someone who maybe is worried about maybe what their employer will think if they come forward and say, hey, I have depression, I have anxiety, I have schizophrenia? Because you are so open, like you're sharing your stories all over and talking about them. What do you say to that person maybe that isn't really sure how they should have that conversation?
Well, it depends on what they want to get out of their employer. If they need to take a leave, what I would say is the law protects you, and from this, you can request FMLA, family medical leave, and if you have depression or you have schizophrenia and you need to take time off, it's just like any other medical leave. So your employer must grant you that leave, right? And that's just what it is. Now, the more that I would say to this person, I know that you're nervous about speaking to your employer about it, and just know that it actually doesn't come from you. It comes from society, and it comes from the fact that these illnesses are so stigmatized and that society has shamed us into this position. So the more that you are brave and you speak out and you talk to your employer about it, the more that we are not going to have to deal with this stigma in the future.
So Sarah, where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Great. Yes, you can visit Stigma Fighters at stigmafighters.com and click on stories to read the stories from people living with mental illness. You can also check me out at sarahfader.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at the Sarah Fader.
Awesome. And we'll link to a couple of your articles in the transcript over on Workology as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about mental illness and how it impacts the workplace.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to you, the listener, for joining us today on the Workology podcast, a podcast for the disruptive work leader who's tired of the status quo. I hope that's you. Let's change the world together. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, you can visit the newly launched and rebranded Workology.com to listen to all our previous Workology podcast episodes. Have a great day.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.